Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of the Dan and Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan,
And I'm Joe.
and we just got done interviewing Junior Rosegrain. As always, brings a huge level of excitement to the show. One of my all-time favorite guests, one of my favorite Auburn football players. Dude just really gets you pumping, and I can only imagine how great of a defensive coordinator he is for his high school.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Joe, he talked about one of the biggest problems that Brian Harson had, and it was something that was pretty documented, is he wasn't a great recruiter and didn't connect well with a lot of the former high school coaches that he has that used to play football at Auburn and using the network that he has in the Southeast. And Junior Rosegreen gave us a prime example of him having five guys that could play D1 football, and he brought him up to meet Brian Harson, and he barely gave him the time of day.
That's true. And ironic that you use the word prime example.
That's right. We're going to get into that a little bit more. But Joe, is now prime time at Auburn because we saw what happened last weekend, which was just, another disappointing chapter in Brian Harson's history of disappointing games at Auburn. They give up 41 points to Arkansas and lose a game where they actually yet again rush for 300 yards and score 27 points. I can tell you that Junior Rosegreen's teams never lost a game where they scored 27 points. The defense at Auburn is really what lately in the last few games has become a complete disaster. And you can tell it's a bad team when it switches from game to game what's bad. At the beginning of the season, defense played pretty good, but the offense was poor. And now in the last three games, the offense has actually played pretty good, but the defense has turned into shambles.
Yeah, there's that seesaw effect. And, you see the performance Saturday and then the recruiting, struggles. And so, it just wasn't the right fit. And it seems like for both sides, it was good for a change.
That's right, Joe. I think it was time. I kind of hate that he got fired the day before his birthday on Halloween, which is also Nick Saban's birthday. Really weird how that turned out.
Yeah,
But the only thing I can say is at least he and his family are going to get $7.5 million during the month of his birthday. So can't feel too bad for him.
that's true. That's true.
Joe, I'll tell you who else I don't feel bad for is Jimbo Fisher. He goes into this game all off season. It's been about how, Nick Saban and Lane Kiffin are clowns, about how Nick Saban cheats in recruiting too, that I didn't do anything wrong, which he didn't. He's using the NIL, but he got so defensive about everything that made you kind of think that he probably was doing something a little untoward to get his players. Uh, he has this team that's full of like nothing but five stars. And Ole Miss goes into College Station in a game that I was very worried about, and I thought it got a very impressive win on Saturday night.
Yeah, absolutely. To win in that environment. Now, I think the third time that Ole Miss has won their program since A&M joined the SEC, they've had more success there than I would have imagined previously. And I just think, that obviously you allowed A&M to make it 31-28 at the end and had to kind of gut it out with a little bit more apprehension, I think, than we would have liked. But a road win in the SEC in a hostile environment like that is still a good win. And, just glad to see Ole Miss go into the bye week and now get some much needed rest.
Yeah, Joe, that was a survive and advance game. That's all it was. I mean, you're going on the road, 105,000 people in Kyle Field, a team that is very talented but has not lived up to expectations. That was a scary game from the get-go, and I thought Ole Miss really did handle themselves pretty well. I mean, they had a two-score lead up until the last possession, and I thought it was kind of good for the defense to have to stop A&M with a minute and a half left and no timeouts. So that was a good growing thing for that defense, actually.
It was, and you also withstood some excitement and energy from the A&M defense at the end. We saw Durkin getting excited on the sidelines. There was kind of that underlying chess match with Durkin against Lane Kiffin with their knowledge of one another's strategies and tendencies. And I think, also, obviously, the story is going to be the running game. Judkins gets the headliner with over 200 yards. But like we talked about last week on the show, having Zach Evans back really made a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, you could see it. Judkins had an even better game because Evans could spell him, and he had that good thunder and lightning combo. And I really thought that the Judkins in particular just did so much better having Zach Evans there to help him.
Yes, absolutely.
And, Joe, one thing that I thought was so huge in that game was, yet again, Lane Kiffin made some really interesting calls. And I thought he was about 1 for 2 on them. And, the first one, the fake punt ended up being a big deal. They got a field goal out of it when they needed to. But I could not believe that. And my wife and a lot of her friends were at that game. And that was a very shocking, risk right there, because he was 4th and 6, and they were on their own 20. And he did that fake punt with Pegues. And Joe, I'll be honest with you, from watching it on TV, I don't think he got the first down. They gave it to him, but it certainly didn't look like he got the first down to me.
It was really close. And, it's one of those things where you would have been nervous if they had called it the other way on the field, definitively. But definitely that was one of those beyond bold calls for Lane Kiffin.
That's right. And that one, I didn't like, but I could understand. In that game, the offense had gotten a little stagnant there for a period of time. It's a little bit of worry about A&M coming back and taking the lead. But the one that really blew my mind, though, was the 4th and 10. It was like 4th and 6 on the A&M 40 when they were winning the game by 10 points. And, of course, we ended up not getting it, and that was when A&M scored their touchdown to get back within 3. That one made no sense to me. Now, he got bailed out by Judkins getting like a 60-yard run the very next possession. But if A&M had come back and won that game, that would have been a huge story, that Lane Kiffin move right there.
Yeah, it really would have been. That would have opened the door for A&M when they were struggling offensively before that.
Joe, I'll say this, though. From A&M's perspective, I feel like you got to be pretty happy about what the future could be for Connor Wegman. He looked really good at the end of that game, especially in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, no, he did. He showed me a lot, showed some strides, and they've got, some young, talented receivers for him as well.
Stewart is going to be a star in this league. That Stewart receiver is really good, and I think that the Wegman's definitely got a bright future, and he certainly is the best option moving forward over Haynes King or Max Johnson.
I think so.
But, I think it was a good win. I always like a win that's like 31-28 because I feel like you got positive things that you can talk about with your offense and your defense. Whenever you score over 30 points, you feel good about your offense. And conversely, when you give up less than 30 points, especially on the road, I feel like that's a pretty solid defensive effort. So I think that's always a score that I like.
Yeah, I've always felt like Lane Kiffin kind of likes winning games where, they can build off of, correcting mistakes, but at the same time, there's that positivity too.
Absolutely. Joe, one thing that I found interesting is you remember how last season, especially against Tennessee, Ole Miss had a lot of questionable injuries during the game.
Yeah.
Interesting how that returned last night with A&M doing it all the time. I think we now know the genesis of Ole Miss's fake injuries from last season.
No, it seems that way. And I heard another show talking about it, Dan. I really think college football's got to do something about that because, not only is it just throwing off, the pace of the play and in the team that's on offense, but it's extending the games. The games are going way too long time-wise. I think the best suggestion I've heard based on the show I was listening to is that if a player is injured and has to come out of a game, they can't come back for the rest of that drive. And I think that would sort it out.
How about you make it a whole quarter? That would be very punitive, and I think that would really stop guys from looking over the sideline and suddenly dropping to the ground.
Yeah, it's got to be something. It's really gotten out of hand.
I mean, you're talking about a guy dropping to the ground, and then you'll see him jump back up. I mean, it happens all the time. Mm-hmm. In that game, there were so many that were it was just insulting to watch.
It is. It reminds me of how flopping in basketball got out of hand a few years ago, and they were able to, get a steady hand on that. They've got to do something similar in football.
Well, you know what? I mean, you got targeting as a 15-yard penalty where somebody gets kicked out of a game. Why don't we do that with fake injuries? If we see that your injury is questionable, I think maybe put an official on there that is a doctor that can check somebody out. And if he gives the opinion that there was nothing wrong with them and this was a fake, And I say that you give a 15-yard penalty and you kick the player out for either a half or a game. That would really, cut that down.
I would be on board with that.
I would too, because it's gotten upsetting. Joe, I'll tell you what else is upsetting. I've been the biggest Sam Hartman fan on the show. I've lauded him. I've said that I thought he was the best quarterback in this year's draft. He's a joy to watch. And I'm sitting here just talking about how great Wake Forest is. How I said that I thought Dave Clawson would be a good person for Auburn to maybe consider as their head coach. And then last week happens. How in the world did they go out and get just the doors blown off them by Louisville in that one? It was like one quarter. I mean, they were winning a game, and all of a sudden they're losing by 35 points.
I mean, Louisville, has got a talented quarterback in Malik Cunningham, but at the same time, we were talking about before the show that I think you said a good point that Louisville has kind of demonstrated that Jekyll and Hyde personality where they've had just kind of shocking upsets so far, where they've won, like 2 or 3 games against the likes of UCF and then now Wake Forest, and we've not seen anywhere close to that performance against inferior teams.
I mean, Louisville should have beaten Florida State too. They lost that one at the very end. But then, yeah, they go out against bad teams like Duke and like just get the doors blown off them, and they just they're a very strange team. And the ACC has been, it usually is a strange conference outside of Clemson, and this year it's really living up to the billing on that.
Definitely.
Joe, talking about epic quarters, so Louisville had a huge quarter that really got them the big win over Wake Forest, where suddenly they curb stomped them. How about this 6-minute period in the fourth quarter? Penn State is beating Ohio State, and then all of a sudden, in the expanse of 6 minutes, Ohio State outscores them 28-3, and suddenly Penn State was in danger of not even covering in this game.
So that was shocking the way that transpired, down the stretch of that game. And, I've said it before this season. Obviously, you've got Marvin Harrison Jr., who I've heard people call him maybe the best receiver right now in college football. But to be without for a large chunk of this season due to injury and, one of your best receiver, maybe the best receiver coming into the season, and like to still have this type of offensive production just tells me a lot about the depth of that team.
Yeah, Joe, and you want to talk about something that's very impressive to me is being in that environment in a night game against Penn State, losing, and then in that just really tough environment to play in, just going on this explosion and putting your foot down and ending the game and taking control of it. That's the sign of a great football team.
Yeah, I think that they're right up there as good as anybody this season.
I'm glad the College Football Playoff Committee made Tennessee number 1 because I thought Tennessee deserved it. I mean, they've been through a murderer's row. They've had to beat LSU in Baton Rouge. They've had to go beat Pittsburgh at Pitt. That's a tough venue. I mean, you've seen it earlier this year, like when West Virginia went up there, that was a pretty lit environment. Of course, they beat Alabama at home and was one of the greatest college football games I've ever seen. And then they followed up by beating Kentucky at home, a scrappy team, and just wiping the floor with them. So, yes, Tennessee deserved number 1. But I will say that if you were a member of the College Football Playoff Committee and you said that you thought Ohio State was the best team, I understand why based on what they did to Penn State.
I think so.
But the team that is number 1, Joe, right now, it's Tennessee, and it's Tennessee by a landslide. They showed up in their Halloween uniforms, the all-black uniforms, and they were the absolute black death to Kentucky, talking about losing 44-6. And, Joe, I called a beatdown all week, but I didn't call a complete slaying. That's what this was. This was like, Freddie Krueger level like slaying that Tennessee laid down on Kentucky on Halloween weekend.
Yeah, I mean, not only to do it against a team like you said, Kentucky, that's scrappy, has some talented players like Rodriguez on offense, but with Tennessee being able to continue to kind of carry the pressure of being that undefeated, highly ranked team with a lot of guys that have never been obviously on that stage before. With that kind of pressure, to me, that says a lot about them too.
Joe, I thought this was a huge elevation for their defense. All year long, it's been about how Tennessee's got the best offense in America. That's what's getting them where they're going. And yeah, that's been their focal point. But I've always thought they had an underappreciated defense. I said I thought their defense in a lot of ways played pretty good against Bryce Young in Alabama. They held down the rushing attack. I don't think that Jahmyr Gibbs had a great game against them. And you could see that they had to throw the ball a bunch of times to get all the points they had against Tennessee. So I always thought this was a good matchup for Tennessee, and I thought they'd flex a little bit on defense. But when I said flex, I didn't mean giving up 6 points. I mean, that was a yeoman's effort on defense. And Byron Young and their defensive line is suddenly looking like one of the best units in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're looking really solid. It's going to make, this week's game really interesting.
By the way, what an interesting person Byron Young is. I learned more about him today. He was on the Feinbaum show and he was talking. I didn't realize that he was actually out of football for 2 years, working at a Dollar General, and he had to go try out for Georgia Military College during COVID and play for a year just to get notice. And then now he's on Tennessee, and it's a good chance he's going to be a first or second round draft pick, maybe win a national championship. Really cool story for him.
Wow. No, that's really impressive.
Yeah. So the Tennessee defense is one to watch this weekend, and when we come into our preview show next, coming up in the next segment, we're going to talk about what that defense could have in store for Georgia. Joe, just a couple more games that we have we want to talk about last week. A lot of surprising outcomes, and not just surprising in how bad how they lost, but how the way in which they lost. Like we talked about Wake Forest, like surprisingly getting drilled by Louisville. There's two more that are even more shocking. Let's go in the middle one. How about Syracuse just getting blitzed by Notre Dame? This Notre Dame team is quite strange. They'll come out. They have that 0-2 start. The first game, they play Ohio State better than anybody else has, getting a lot of accolades. Then they go out and lay an egg against Marshall. Then they come back and they win a few games, and everyone's like, okay, well, we're giving the new coach the benefit of the doubt. And then all of a sudden they lose to Stanford. It's like the first time that Stanford beat anybody decent in the last 5 years. I have no idea how David Shaw is still Stanford's coach, by the way. That's got to be one of the most, ridiculous things that there is. There's patience, which as an Auburn fan, I know we're known for not having a lot of patience as coaches, but Stanford's patience is like the redwood trees they support in terms of what they have while still having David Shaw as their head coach.
Yeah, that's true. And going back to Syracuse, I thought there was a chance the game against Notre Dame could be somewhat interesting because of Syracuse still getting over the shockwaves of that collapse against Clemson.
Yeah.
But I definitely didn't expect, the dominant performance that Notre Dame did.
What scared me for Notre Dame was how good Syracuse's defense is. I didn't think that Notre Dame would be able to, with Drew Pine, be able to get a lot of points against them. But they ended up dropping 48 points on Syracuse and completely shutting down their rushing attack, which that's the one thing that Syracuse had. They have a very good running back. And he only got like 50 yards against Notre Dame. And that was a great win for Notre Dame. They really kind of dominated them in that one.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Now, interested to see, how close they can play against Clemson.
Absolutely. I'm also interested to see that, whether Dino Babers gets a look, the Syracuse coach, at some of the bigger jobs this year, because I feel like he didn't answer the call last time when the iron got hot and people wanted him to be the head coach. Had a few down years, and I really thought he was going to get fired. If I were him, if someone comes calling that's a big boy, it might be time to get out of Syracuse.
Yeah, because, Matt Campbell's probably waited a little bit too long.
Yeah, Matt Campbell is no longer on any of the lists. I think last time when Auburn was looking at a coach, that's who I wanted desperately, was Matt Campbell. His name was getting mentioned. I haven't heard him get linked to a single one of the big job openings. Auburn, Nebraska, Wisconsin. He's not getting brought up for any of them anymore.
Mm-hmm. I think I saw maybe him as an outlier for Auburn, but there were like 13 coaches on that list.
Yeah, that's pretty low on the list. Joe, speaking of someone that used to be an outlier for a lot of SEC coaching jobs, how about the awful loss that Mike Gundy had to Kansas State over the weekend? 48-0. Joe, I made the mistake of putting money on that game and taking Oklahoma State because I've been betting them a lot this year. And they go out and they score 0 points and lose 48-0 to a backup quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, far fetched to call it one of the more shocking upsets being in college, or not more shocking scores in college football history, especially historically, with that being like the worst ever loss or deficit for a top 10 team.
Absolutely. I mean, I was at one of the worst games ever for a top 10 team. And that was one that Junior Rosegren actually would have been on the field for. And that was when Auburn lost 23-0 to USC in 2003. I think Auburn was preseason number 1 in the country. I think USC, they may have been borderline top 10. They came into Jordan Hare and beat Auburn 23-0. That was a really embarrassing game. But that was against a team that ultimately won the national championship. This Kansas State team is maybe good enough to make a New Year's Six game if they went out potentially. They're of course not going to be USC with Matt Weiner and Reggie Bush, but they beat them 48-0. So I mean that's double what happened to Junior Rosegren and Auburn at that time. That's just an utterly embarrassing loss for Mike Gundy, who had a team that a lot of people were talking about, even with their loss to TCU, is maybe a team that could still sneak back in the playoff. They're going to be lucky to make a New Year's Six game now, and it's looking more like maybe they're an Alabama Bowl type team.
I think so. After that, it's looking like maybe an 8-4 type season.
That's right, Joe. And, Mike Gundy is one who I think he's a lifer at Oklahoma State. I mean, of course, he played quarterback there, and he's just the ultimate Oklahoma State guy. He even wears leotards and talks about how he wants to promote their wrestling team, which I've got a little cousin now that's a wrestler out in Oklahoma that desperately wants to be an Oklahoma State wrestler. So he does a good job promoting that. They got one of the best wrestling programs in the country, actually. And I just, I think Mike Gundy fits so well there, but I hated that for him. That was such a rough loss. And I think those people who think that he's never going to get over the hump, this is just even more, ammunition for him that Gundy's never going to be a guy that makes college football playoff.
Right.
And, sadly, with losses like that, you wouldn't even make the 12-team college football playoff.
No, maybe not even 32.
That's right. All right, Joe. When we come back, we're gonna talk about all the big games this weekend: Tennessee and Georgia, Alabama and LSU. Joe, I don't know about you, but I'm still in shock that I heard Junior Rosegren pick Tennessee to beat Georgia this weekend.
It's gonna be interesting.
It should be. All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about all of those. Of course, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at DJ Sports Show, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're posting all of our new episodes. You can see us in live and living color. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.